this past week, it was the 30th anniversary of Space Ghost Coast to Coast. And I thought, since this is the 30th anniversary, I had a lot of options of episodes I could talk about. I wanted to talk about the development process of Space Ghost Coast to Coast, going from the 3 pilots that they made, or 2 pilots, and then the first episode, and how the show eventually formed to what it was, using these 3 things. Because I actually find it kind of interesting, and then when you eventually watch the first episode, you're a little like, how the fuck did we get here? And it's sort of an interesting story in my mind. So the first attempt at Space Ghost was actually with Andy Merrill, or the voice of Brack, who was a writer on Space Ghost as well. But as him as Space Ghost, and it was just Space Ghost clips and his voice over it. I don't think the lips really matched, sort of, if you kind of get your brain to. Interviewing clips from Denzel Washington. They were going to air this in some degree, but apparently to use the footage of Denzel Washington, it would have cost them like $20,000, which is probably more money than Space Ghost cost at the time. So they couldn't actually use it. They did recreate this. It's on the Volume 2 DVD. I forget if I have that one, but you could find it on the Internet Archive of the Andy Merrill pilot. You sort of get the vibe, a little bit of Space Ghost. It's just Space Ghost. There's no Zorak or Moltar. It's not too crazy. And I also think kind of the problem, and probably what they realized, is I've heard Denzel tell those stories before in other interviews. It's not really good stories for making fun of someone. It's just sort of good anecdotes, and Space Ghost, the joke is that Space Ghost is interviewing them. And I think Space Ghost to Coast was actually more than just that. There were jokes and there was funny there. So I think they probably came to that and realized, 1, they can't use footage that costs $20,000, and 2, had to figure out a better way to use it. They made a second pilot. Now this pilot is actually lost. And this pilot, I think, gets into a sort of criticism when Space Ghost came out, but that Gary Owens, who is the voice of the original Space Ghost from the show, was the voice of Space Ghost in this one, and he interviews Emma Thompson and Chris Gore from Film Threat. I sort of wish Chris Gore wasn't involved in this because he's a little cringy, but or is total cringe. But apparently, since we've never seen it, it's lost. We've seen some pictures. It's lost. We've never seen it, but it's supposed to be a coming soon style interview show. I can't imagine. Gary Owens did a great job. We haven't seen it, and I don't know what the humor was like. I have no indication that Zorak and Moltar are in this at all, which is another thing. I also am not sure. It seems like sort of the format of what would happen in the actual first episode, but we don't know anything. I don't know why they won't air this. I'm not sure if Gary Owens is just really bad. I am curious what this would have been. A criticism when Space Ghost Coast to Coast came out, because I was in comic book stores and a few comic conventions I went to, was that they were forgetting about the legacy of the Space Ghost cartoon. There were a lot more people about it, since there was barely an internet then. There was no Twitter complaining not my Space Ghost or something like that. If it happened now, I'm sure those people would be a lot more vocal, but there were people who were upset about it. So had they known about this, I'm curious what their reaction would be. So it's kind of interesting that the original voice of Space Ghost was on this. I know people like Alex Toth, who designed Space Ghost, I don't think is a fan of Coast to Coast, from my understanding. Maybe I'm wrong about that. But it's interesting that they actually did try to do it with the original voice of Space Ghost. But then we get the actual first episode of Space Ghost Coast to Coast, called Spanish Translation. This is, the first episode is a lot of stuff happening at once. And it's almost too crazy and frenetic to take in. I forgot how much is going on. First off, they have these random stops of a Spanish translation of something, which doesn't make any sense. This is the extreme Dadaism of Space Ghost Coast to Coast is on display in the actual first episode. It's interesting how it almost sets up the show too much. It's crazy when a first episode is a little more chaotic than the actual show, which is saying something with Space Ghost. But just in this first episode, we have an MST3K segment. We have Spanish translations of stuff for some reason. We also have Space Ghost, it cuts to him within a TV. Why? I don't know. It doesn't fit the show. There's a bunch of breaks of watching. There's a bunch of Bracks watching Space Ghost and then doing a Beavis and Butthead impression. Zorak and Moltar have like an album they're pushing at the same time, and all of this is happening at the same time of two guests, which is Susan Powter, which does make a random trans joke, which is like kind of an aside thing, but I don't really know who she is. I had to look her up. I sort of remember her being around, but I don't remember her show. Other than that trans joke that she chose to make for some reason, that didn't make me really like her that much. But we also get appearances from Kevin Meaney and the Bee Gees, who all seem to be like kind of game for the whole Space Ghost thing. I thought the first season had more like people who were unaware of what they were doing, but I guess maybe I'm misremembering. This was a crazy episode. The MST3K thing is interesting because I believe Joel Hodgson worked on developing it and wrote a few episodes and then appeared on it. So that's odd. It is them, like they do the seats thing and stuff and all that stuff. But this kind of shows me like they were developing it and then suddenly like just went like fucking nuts at the end, and nobody expected them to do that. But I think the first episode is really like such an improvement on the other pilot and such an understanding of the concept, and that you needed to have more than just that Space Ghost was interviewing people. And I think that's why, like, initially in 94, like, even in the 90s, like, pretty soon after, people were like, this is a watershed moment, this is changing animation, there's all these things. And I can kind of see it because it's so wild. You're like, what the hell am I watching? And even though I've seen this episode 1,000,001 times, I think that first episode really is a trip, man. It is pretty wild. So I appreciate that they realized they had to throw everything at the wall, but it does it in such an insane way. Sometimes I'm like, what is going on? But it's like also like I can tell why I liked it so much. So it's interesting to see where they went from just Andy Merrill doing Space Ghost, just doing a regular interview, to the craziness that was this. But sometimes the development process takes you in crazy ways, and it's crazy to see where Space Ghost ended up to becoming the show that it was. I want to give a shout out to a video before I start this segment because I feel like it indirectly sort of helped with this video, but they made, this one says Stay Up Late Productions made a video called Space Ghost Coast to Coast Lost Pilot Episodes. I will talk about those, but at the same time this is a different thing because I'm talking about the whole development process and stuff like that. But I recommend, if you want to know more about the Lost things, you check out that video.